Hello, hello. How is everyone? It's Friday. Now that we're finally getting close to 100 days of pandemic, it feels like 1,000. So we're here this evening with Danielle Trussoni and Tim Weed and our drink, of course. And they will be discussing Danielle's book and The Ancestor, which I have to confess made me totally forget the pandemic, politics, and every other crazy thing going on in our world right now. I am going this evening with a nice French rosé. What is everybody else drinking?
I've got Bert Monte's favorite drink here. It's a gin and tonic with extra lime.
Nice.
I love it. I wish I had thought of that. I'm having an Aperol Spritz, which is Italian, so on theme.
Yes.
Okay. So Tim Weed is the author of short fiction collection, A Field Guide to Murder and Fly Fishing, and the young adult novel Will Poole's Island. He serves on the core faculty of the Newport MFA in creative writing and as an instructor at GrubStreet, the country's largest independent creative writing center. He's a member of the Vermont Humanities Council's Speakers Bureau, and he's also a member of the Brattleboro Literary Festival Committee, and he lives here in Vermont. So, Tim.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. And thanks to the Brattleboro Literary Festival for hosting this series. It's really exciting. And I like the sort of the fun twist on talking about literature with drinks in hand. I should really stress that we don't necessarily condone only alcoholic drinks. So if you don't drink,
you're right.
Pull up a seltzer or a lemonade or a kombucha or whatever. But here we are, and I'm really excited to be here in sort of a celebratory mood with my friend Danielle Trussoni. So Danielle is a New York Times, USA Today, and Sunday Times top 10 best-selling novelist. She has been a Pulitzer Prize in fiction jurist and writes the Dark Matters column for the New York Times Book Review, which is focused on horror fiction. She created the Writerly podcast, a weekly podcast about the art and business of writing, and her novels have been translated into 33 languages. So we will have lots to talk about today. Her work includes 5 books: Falling Through the Earth, Angelology, Angelopolis, The Fortress, and The Ancestor, which is the one that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. She is the recipient of the Michener-Copernicus Society of America Award, the Dana Award in the Novel, and the New York Times Top 10 Books of the Year. In addition to being published in the New York Times Book Review, she's also been in The Guardian, the New York Times Magazine, and Tin House, and her writings have been widely anthologized. It's really a privilege to me to have gotten to know Danielle a little bit as a colleague at the Newport MFA in Creative Writing, which is a wonderfully dynamic and exciting low residency Master of Fine Arts program where we're both members of the core faculty. So Danielle, welcome. It is so great to be with you. Here is, salud.
Cheers to you.
Yes, cheers. Really, really enjoyed The Ancestor.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Tim, for that very long introduction. Sometimes I feel like just saying like, hi, here I am, rather than having all of the lists of things I've done. But thank you for that. And thank you to the Brattleboro Literary Festival for having me. This is the first time I've had the experience of being part of the Brattleboro Literary Festival. And I have to selfishly say that I'm a little bit happy that we're doing it on Zoom because I wasn't going to be able to come physically this year. So this is giving
I know, we're so disappointed.
I know, and I was too. And so this is giving me, finding, a silver lining, I guess. This is giving me an opportunity to speak with you and have the experience of being part of this literary festival, which I've heard so much about from many different authors. But I also want to thank Sandy and Jerry and everyone who's put this together. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm thrilled to be able to be here.
Yes, it's really great. Well, let's chalk this up to maybe one of the upsides of the pandemic is that we get to meet in forums like this that we might not otherwise get a chance to talk. And I always have been incredibly intrigued with Danielle's work and with Danielle herself as a writer. And so I'm really hoping that we can get into some of the weeds, so to speak, about the writing craft and you know, the book and everything else. So anyway, well, let's just get started. I was sort of wondering or hoping that you might want to do a little read from the book.
Sure, yeah, I have the book here. I thought, because I'm sure that most people who are here have not read the book, or a large portion of them, I didn't want to jump in the middle. So I'll just start with the first couple of pages. It's going to be just about 5 minutes long. And we begin with Bert Monte, who, to give you a spoiler, likes to drink gin and tonic with extra lime, as Tim is drinking. So here's to you, Bert. But so this is the beginning of the book. To discover you are the heir to a noble title in the 21st century is like winning a fortune in the lottery, the Mega Millions or a Powerball jackpot, only to find your prize will be paid out in francs or lira. Suddenly, you are rich, but rich in a currency that has no value in the modern world. Or so it seemed to me upon learning that I was the last living descendant of the ancient House of Monte, a family whose power, from the Middle Ages to the unification of Italy in the 19th century, was immense, whose sons, because only sons mattered in those unenlightened times, had fought religious wars and married minor princesses, and sired noble children, but whose fortunes and fertility had diminished as the modern world rose, leaving me, Bert Monte, a 28-year-old American woman with few social graces and zero knowledge of European history, the sole blood heir to an ancestral domain in the mountains of northern Italy. It all began early one Saturday morning just before Christmas. I was living alone, although Luca's things were still at the house. He'd been taking clothes to his new apartment slowly, week by week, a pair of jeans here, a t-shirt there, in an effort to keep our lives intertwined. His plan was working. We saw each other often and had gone out for dinner and a movie the month before. While we'd been separated for 6 months, and it had been my idea for him to move out, I found it comforting to have my husband around. We'd been together for nearly 10 years, and despite the problems, which were mostly my problems, as we both would agree, it was hard to imagine life without him. My parents were gone, and I had no brothers or sisters, aunts or uncles or cousins. Luca was the only family I had. Until, that is, the letter arrived from Italy. A knock came at the door, and I left off decorating the Christmas tree, a 3-foot fir festooned with tinsel and blinking lights, to answer. It was a cold, sunny December morning, the sky so bright that the envelope glinted like a mirror in my hand. I signed my name on an electronic pad, wished the delivery man happy holidays, and was back inside before I saw that the envelope was addressed not to me, Bert Monte, but to someone named Alberta Isabel Eleanor Vittoria Montebianco. I sat down at the kitchen table, pushed aside tinsel and glass bulbs so that I could get a better look. The return address was from Torino, Italia. A parade of bright Italian stamps floated at the top right corner of the glossy envelope. The words Alberta Isabel Eleanor Vittoria Montebianco scrolled across the center. Although everyone called me Bert, my given name was Alberta, so that part made sense. Still, I was hesitant to open something that might not belong to me. But Alberta was my name after all, and the address was my address. And so without further debate, I ripped the envelope open. A sheaf of thick A4-sized pages fell into my hand. The top page was covered in calligraphy, and in the bottom right corner, gleaming like a first-place medal, shone a golden seal of a castle floating above 2 mountains. The paper alone was something to behold. Heavy bond linen stock, creamy and thick, with an ink signature pressed into the fiber by the nib of a fountain pen. The text was dense and entirely foreign. Turning the pages, I tried to find something I could understand, but aside from the name Montebianco, which appeared about every other line, it was entirely incomprehensible. Holding up the envelope, I said the name aloud, Alberta Isabel Eleanor Vittoria Montebianco, fumbling over the syllables as if I were a child learning to read. My first thought was to call Luca. He always knew what to do. Logical, reliable, sane. These were the qualities I loved about him, and the qualities that bound us still, even after all the rough times we'd been through. I'd known Luca most of my life. We had attended the same schools. We had practically grown up together, and he knew me better than anyone. He had grieved with me after the last miscarriage, and he was the one who suggested we go to therapy, volunteering to join me, even when it was clear that I needed it more than he did. Luca had always believed that with a little work and preparation, we could survive anything. But one thing was certain, neither of us could have prepared for a letter like the one from the estate of the Monte Bianco family. I remember sitting there in my kitchen, turning the envelope over in my hands. A strange feeling came over me then, clear as a voice in my ear. It was a warning, a premonition of danger. I wonder now, after all that I've learned about the Monte Bianco family and all that has happened since that snowy December day, what my life would be like had I tossed the envelope into the recycling bin with the junk mail and old newspapers. But I didn't. To find Luca. So that's how it opens. That sets it up.
That is such a wonderful opening. I actually, I teach a class at GrubStreet about, it's called Killer Openings. And
oh, really? Oh, I would love that class.
Oh, it's a great class. I want to use this because it is so clear. I can't imagine that anyone, listening to this right now, having listened to that, wouldn't want to read the book. There's something that, writers call the contract, which is sort of like, okay, when a reader picks up a book and reads the first couple of pages, the first couple of pages, one of the things they really need to do is to, tell us what the book is going to be, or sort of show us what the book is going to be about. And so this is so clear, and it captured me anyway. Absolutely. Very, very clear and vivid, wonderful opening. So congratulations.
Thank you. When I think about openings in general, there's a couple of things that I always look for, and maybe this is part of the contract. One of them is like, what's the tone going to be, right? Like, is this funny? Is this a literary novel that's very serious? Is this, or a horror novel or suspense? I feel like that has to be there right away. But also, who is talking and where are we going and what's this, what's the situation and what do we want?
Yeah, sort of the DNA of the book, right? And sort of like the DNA of the book has to be very, very clear and present, but also what you managed to do in this opening, I think, is to create a real infusion of suspense. And that's one of the things maybe that we could talk about a little bit later is suspense, because I think that you do a wonderful job with that in this book. This is a book where the pages really turn themselves, and you start reading it and you are swept up in the story, which is a wonderful story. But so I wanted to ask you, sort of kicking it out, like, how would you define this book in terms of genre? Because I've heard a lot of people saying, or critics, or on the back it says Gothic horror. I mean, is it Gothic horror? What is Gothic horror? And I'm not sure that fully describes it. I mean, any thoughts on how you would sort of describe the genre of this book?
Well, so that seems to be, with every book I write, there seems to be one thing that keeps coming up. And I think, actually, Angelology was a little bit like this too. It's not really in specifically one genre. I like to mix it up. I like to play with genre.
Yeah.
First of all, I'll just say, I consider myself, in what my training is and the way that I like to write is literary, right? So I love language. I like to play with language. I think character is very important in any work of fiction. But I also have become over time obsessed with plotting. I like to enter a novel, enter a world that I get swept up in, and I want to know an answer to some questions, and I move through it. So, but that said, this has been called Gothic, Gothic horror. It's been called a suspense novel. It was reviewed as a mystery, which I guess it could be a mystery too. The review that I actually liked the best was in the National Book Review. A reviewer basically said, it's a mashup of a lot of different genres, and in the end she created her own genre. And I think, you know, for me, that's what this is. It's the Danielle Trussoni genre, one that has mythology, suspense, literary writing, and, you know, generally something that's kind of speculative. Like, I like to create a world that is like ours, exactly like ours, that you feel like you're in our world, but then something goes off at an angle and kind of goes sideways, and you're like, oh wait, is that real? Could that happen? And, you know, in Angelology, which was my first novel, I did that by doing a ton of research and historical excavation of about angels and about biblical expressions of how actually terrifying angels were depicted in the beginning of, you know, like Christianity, essentially.
Yeah.
And I did that here with a different kind of creature. I don't want to give us too much away for those who haven't read it, but you know, basically I was excavating human origins and the history and ancestry of humankind. So you know, that goes back. There was a lot of research into evolution, and you know, there was a really wonderful book, I think a lot of people have probably read it, called Homo Sapiens, that really just explores the whole universe of what it means to be human historically. And so that became part of it. But anyway, so to get back to your question, all of those things and those interests got sort of packed down into one storyline and became its own thing.
Well, I think you succeeded marvelously in creating your own genre. And it is funny, the whole genre thing is a bugbear of mine too, because it's sort of like, the genres, I mean, they're there for a reason. They're there to help sell books and to help categorize books and things like that. But really, when you're a novelist, what you're trying to do is write the kind of book that you would want to read that doesn't exist, right? And so oftentimes that doesn't fit into a neat genre. So I'm glad to hear you say that you succeeded creating your own genre here.
Right. I mean, of course, people do. You're right. In order to put the book someplace in the library or to put the book someplace in the bookstore, you do need to give it a label. And so I've been fascinated over the course of my 5 books to see where people put things, you know, and it's always fascinated me. You know, this one has been put mostly in literary fiction or horror. Whereas my first 2 novels were either in literary fiction or thrillers. So let's see what the next one is.
Yeah.
Maybe sci-fi for the next one.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, we can talk about that later.
Hey.
So I want to sort of back up and could you, because I know this is a question that a lot of people would ask, and that is, by the way, I should say we do have this Q&A function here on Zoom. And so if anyone has a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A thing, and we'll check that a little later. We'll come back and ask any questions that people have that haven't been answered by our conversation. But so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your personal background, and particularly with regard to writing. Why did you become a novelist? What was it that made you become a novelist? How did you sort of arrive at this career?
Such an interesting question, because it's sort of a chicken or an egg question. I don't know, you know, what came first, you know, the life or the writing, because really the way that I tell myself this story is that I taught myself to write in order to write about my father. My first book was a memoir about my relationship with my father, who was a tunnel rat in the Vietnam War. And when he was dying, which coincidentally he died the month that book was published, and his photo was in reviews on the day that his obituary was published. So it was like a very weird sort of circle for me. But when he was ill, he gave me a small box of things of mine that he had saved from when I was growing up. And one of them was this little tiny Mead notebook, you know, just a little thing. And in it, I had started writing scenes from my life about my relationship with my dad, but other things too. And some of those notes were in the book that was being published. So I think that I had always wanted to learn how to express that relationship. And I took different paths. For example, as an undergraduate, I studied literature, but I took a second major in history and focused really on the Vietnam War, and did a lot of research about tunnel rats and what my father had done as a soldier, and went to Vietnam and really dug very deeply into what happened to him there. And so by the end of it, and actually first I wrote this all as a novel, wrote this big long novel. It was my MFA project, and it didn't sell, right? Like, so as for so many people, your first book, you know, your baby, you put all of your best writing and all of your hopes and dreams into it. And sometimes it doesn't sell. It didn't sell. Yeah. And which was a good thing, because what happened is I took a step back and I realized that all of that intention and all of that work was to tell the truth about my relationship with my father, not a novel that, you know, had lots of fantastical elements and other things, and it might have been pretty or well written or whatever, but it just wasn't what I really wanted to do. So I went away and I wrote a memoir, and that was the book that was published first. Gotcha. And after that book came out, that's, you know, when I became, I guess, you know, you say chose the career of being a writer. I guess that's what I did, because that's what I knew how to do at that point, right? I had put so much effort and so much time into learning how to write to tell that one story. I wanted to go further. I wanted to go on with that career. The problem being is that the thing that it's like kicking the ladder out from under you when you climb up, because the thing that I had wanted to tell, that story was gone. So then where do you go? Right? Like that, and what do you do to create momentum and the stories that you want to tell?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, this sort of brings up the question, like, we had a little conversation before this with Jerry Carbone, who works with the Brattleboro Literary Festival, and thank you, Jerry, for organizing this Zoom talk, because he's really good with technology and he set it all up. But he asked something about, you know, well, he said something about, and I think Sandy said something too, about how this is such a great book for the current moment that we find ourselves in, because it's a book that you read it and you forget about your day. You can forget about your sort of daily existence. And so I wonder, you know, what you think about that. I mean, is fiction in a time of pandemic, or just fiction in general? Do you have any thoughts about why fiction is, you know, why it can function like that, and why is it important in our current world? And any.
So I actually I have strong feelings about this, because I think, you know, I really disagree with the idea of that escapist art is bad, right? Like we always hear this, oh, it's escapism. I'm just going to sit and I'm not educating myself or something. You know, the first Greek plays were put on to bring people out of the agora, right? Out of the crush of the daily life, bring them to a space together where they escaped, where they were absorbed in story, absorbed in drama. So that they could feel something. It's an emotional experience that is an escape from our daily life. So I really have always strived to create that. Like, I feel like I would fail if someone was reading one of my books and said, oh yeah, you know, or like looking at their watch, or, you know, really not absorbed into it. So I guess specifically right now, I think it's very difficult for people emotionally to feel that they can escape. I don't know if you feel that way, but even when I'm writing, I feel like, oh, I should be following the news, or I should be checking on what's going on. Things are so fraught, and I feel so much empathy also for the people who are out in the streets, and I'm not, right? I'm not out there right now. So I feel like somehow I should be supporting that, and like that going away and writing is escapism, right? Not even the act of reading, but going away and not being politically. Example of how good things can be, right? I think we are helping. We're contributing to creating something that's better. Yeah. So I'm all for it. I do think that there is a place, and a good place for that.
Yeah, I have to say, I totally agree with you. You know, I was reading recently a quote that Neil Gaiman was sort of paraphrasing something that Tolkien said. And I don't know if I'll get this right, but he said something like, you know, the people in the world that are against the concept of escape are jailers, which is an interesting.
Yeah, leave it to Neil. Oh, that was Tolkien. I was going to say,
yeah.
Something so funny and like
so
that.
I love that, but also I feel like, you know, I think what you're talking about is this idea. I mean, you know, the reason that I became a novelist is because, you know, I had books allowed me to escape in a way, and it is escape, but it's also making a connection. I mean, that's what really good fiction does, is it makes a connection. It allows you to see the world from inside the consciousness of another being. And I definitely felt that in the Ancestor, and you know, and I think that that's something that we all crave, because we all, you know, we're all sort of living our lives fundamentally alone within our own consciousness, and fiction provides us with one of the only chances we have to make that connection with another consciousness. And so, and the more escapist, you know, the better. I love the sort of entering the dream on the page, which is, I think, something that you accomplished very well in the Ancestor.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We both agree. We both agree at that point.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page.
We're on the same page about the dream being, you know, as valuable as the waking.
Yeah, and you know, I would also add that I think escapist novels aren't necessarily light novels. In other words, escapist novels don't necessarily have, you know, that are sort of free floating with no theme of importance. And I think that, you know, that kind of brings me to the next line of questioning, which is, well, I want to, you know, I think that there are some really interesting themes that are very relevant to what a lot of people today are thinking about and you know, researching and things like that. And well, let me start out with a question. So like, how did the novel come to you? How did you come upon this idea of the Ancestor?
Well, so obviously it was in a few stages, but the initial idea came after I myself took a DNA test, a 23andMe, just a spit test. So for those people who don't know the story, this letter that that Bert just received, it's coming because she took a DNA test and her information was stored in a database, and it was connected to some people, and she discovers that she has a family in the Italian Alps that she didn't know. So that's how that happened. It happened through a DNA test. So I took one of these tests, and I grew up in a kind of, my father's family was Italian American, and very proudly so, and a big family. And as I got older, I saw that members of that extended family had relationships with people in the village that my great grandfather had come from, and there's like this Italian American pride happening. And so I really identified sort of partially as Italian American. And I found out that I was only 1.7% Italian. And I was like, what, what's going on? So at first I thought maybe, it was a Danny Shapiro situation. So if you hear music, I'm on my porch. But it wasn't. I had my sister took the same test and she got the same result. So we were like, okay, clearly there's something else going on. What we discovered, it's all about the way that they classify it. The Northern Italian genetic spread is largely Austrian, French, Swiss, German, Northern European. So that's what I was being classified as. But anyway, the initial shock of that, the initial surprise, was what sent me off on a sort of tangent narratively. Like I asked myself, what would be the strangest thing that could happen if you take a DNA test? Where could it lead a character? What would happen if you discovered that you had DNA that was very unusual, like maybe not even human? So, all of that came together in this story. I mean, not that it took many drafts, of course, to get to the place where it was when it was published, but that general idea and that architecture sort of came early.
Yeah. So yeah, that's very interesting that you bring this up, and I'm trying to figure out how to sort of bridge this topic without giving too much away about the book. But there are elements in this book that are really interesting with regard to this question of genealogy, ancestry, and also, you know, questions that you mentioned earlier on about early hominids, early humans, Neanderthals, you know, that kind of thing. And so I'm curious, maybe you could talk a little bit about your research for this book and how that kind of went and where it.
So I read a lot, right? Like I read a lot of books about it. I read books about genetics. I consulted an expert who is my neighbor, who is actually here, that we can talk to later if anyone would like to ask her some questions about genealogy or genetics. And I went out looking, like, so I was in Paris, and there was an exhibit about Neanderthal man, like an entire museum dedicated to this question of what was the Neanderthal. And, you know, we have this idea that, you know, the Neanderthals are like these stupid, brawny, ape-like humans. But what they're finding, and what really fascinated me, is that Neanderthals were actually probably as advanced as Homo sapiens. The vocal cords are swollen, and in a way it shows that they had language. Their civilizations had, you know, they had fire, they were cooking, they were making art, you know, and so it's fascinating to me that we survived and these other strains of humans didn't. I think it was 100,000 years ago. Or nationalism, but different species of humans. I mean, I think that it's fascinating to think about. And, you know, when I said before that I go, in all my books, I have a speculative element that I like to bring in. It's always based on a what if question. What if this were so, and what if this were true? And then the passionate sort of like digging and research to make it possible narratively in a book. Because it's one thing to imagine it. It's one thing to think, oh, what if that happened? That would be cool. But it's another to make it viable for a reader going through the little machinery of your book to believe it. And that, you know, that required tons of research.
Yeah, I imagine. And then it probably also required throwing away tons of research, right? I mean, that's always my experience.
Yeah, well, so that's a whole nother story. The book was 100 pages longer when I turned it in. My editor cut a lot. Most of that was the research, you know, the stuff that we put in there to make ourselves feel confident that people get what we're trying to do.
Well, we're also fascinated by it, right? We're like, we've done all this research. We're like, this is so interesting, you guys.
Exactly. Isn't this great? I think I'm going to write 2 chapters just about, you know, how this works. But so me being someone who hates to waste her material, I took most of that and I wrote an audio drama.
Oh, is that where that comes from? Oh, that's
yeah. So that audio drama, it's called Crypto Z, and everyone can go down and subscribe. You can listen to it for free. It's on Apple.
Yeah, what's it about?
It's Crypto Z,
yep.
And it's about cryptozoology. So for those of you who don't know that, that's the study of creatures that may or may not exist, that science hasn't discovered them yet, like Bigfoot or the Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster or the mermaids or whatever. And so it's a very sci-fi kind of, you know, but very scientific window into scientists who are looking for those things.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I use that material that way.
It's so cool. I mean, because I love this, and I want to talk about this in a minute, the way that you incorporate science. But I just wanted to say that, you know, I mean, one of the revelations of modern genomics has been this idea, you know, that actually, you know, this discovery that all of us, or many of us, have a percentage of Neanderthal DNA This was something we couldn't even imagine before. But there have been many other discoveries having to do with genomics that really inform, who we are as a species, a human species. And so I just love the fact that this book is in addition to being a suspenseful tale, and a fun escapist read, is also right in the middle of that stuff. And so maybe we could turn to that now. Like, so your other critics have said that you have this really interesting mix of forget about the critics, I'll say it myself, that you have a very interesting mix of science and sort of fantastical elements, or not supernatural, but fantastic, let's say, just fantastical elements, and but it's a really unique combination. And it sounds like that was kind of what from the beginning, that's been your kind of focus as a fiction writer.
Well, yes, in some ways, yes. But I will say that there are certain kind of writers who, when they ask a reader to suspend disbelief, they'll be like, oh, they can fly on a so far, because what I'm interested in is taking our world and seeds that have been planted through mythology or science or the Bible or other, basically cultural history, taking these sort of wild potential stories and then building a scaffolding around it to make it so that when you walk in, you're like, oh, actually, that could have happened. And that's why it could have happened. And so that for me is what's really thrilling and fun. It's basically the world building, right? When people talk about world building, often they're talking about whatever the rules are of that world. I take the rules of our world and I generally don't break them. And I try to make basically everything believable within that system. So yeah, it's fantastical, but fantastical with lots of steps that sort of build up to that.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that I think we saw a little bit in the opening, and I think we see throughout, that this is a story that Monte is sort of an every woman. Like, this could be any of us that this could happen to, and her life at the beginning is very, it's like we recognize everything. We're like, yes, okay, we could have just talked to this person, we could have just seen this person at the grocery store, and I think that's a wonderful thing, because you ground us in this sort of grittiness of reality, that we can, you can take us places that are pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I hope so. That's what I want to do. And those are the kind of books I like too, right? So I also, sometimes people ask me like, what do you, I'm a writer starting out, and should I be writing in this genre, or should I be writing that way? And my answer to that is always just write what you like, because you're going to be in that book or in that space for a really long time, and it's hard to imagine writing something you don't like. So yeah, I just write pretty much what I like to read.
Yeah. So tell us about that, though. I mean, you're in the process for a long time. I mean, whenever someone asks me how long it takes to write a book, I'm like, I don't know. It takes me a long time because I work on lots of things.
Yeah.
But what's your process? I mean, I assume that there's a lot of rewriting. There's obviously a lot of research. I mean, how does that all get integrated into the writing of a book?
Well, so I've started writing a new book now, and I'm kind of watching myself more carefully, because I think for the first couple of books I didn't pay attention. I don't know, like I was just like, what the hell is this? I have to somehow get through this, and it's like you're holding on for dear life just to get a book written. Right. But I feel like now this is book 6, and so I'm feeling a little more comfortable maybe in the process. So I am paying attention, and I've noticed that the process is very, at least in this book, and I think the last couple, it's been, I have an idea. I know a beginning, middle, and end, and I sort of make a rough pathway to that beginning, middle, and end. But all of the steps in between are fluid, and I throw them away and start over almost on a weekly basis. Like, for example, today I changed in the morning when my mind is not cluttered. I don't, I do certain, I have all sorts of little rituals.
Yeah. So what would you describe your percentage of the, like, rough percentage of sort of first draft writing to revision or rewriting?
So let me think. I write a fast first draft. Yeah. Right. For example, I'm writing now the first draft, and I'm writing about 2,000 words a day. Very fast. It's a mess, but I'm getting it out there. It's basically, I think of it like shooting the film. If you're, you have to shoot a lot of film and then cut it down to make the movie. I'm just making lots of extra material that I'm going to cut into the book. And then, it's a longer revision process. I spent more than that, a year and a half just with my editor working on revisions for this book. When I turned it in, it was 100 pages longer, had a different ending, it was very different in the middle, and I spent a long time rewriting. So that's my process, basically, is making a big, loose, sort of amorphous thing in the beginning, and then getting very serious and critical with myself as I go through and revise.
I love that metaphor that you used about a film, that you're sort of shooting all of this material and then you're going to cut it in later. I've never heard it described that way, but that's a great way to say it. Well, that actually brings up another question. This is sort of maybe, I don't know if this is off topic, but this is something I would want to ask you anyway. And that is, what do you see as the sort of differences between are there salient differences between fiction and film?
It's such an interesting question.
Like what can fiction do that film can't? And
yeah.
versa,
I think about that all the time, actually, because our culture has moved so heavily into being a visual culture, in every sense of the word. If you remember this book by Camille Paglia a long time ago, where she was talking about the difference between a literary culture and a visual culture, and what that means. I think we're really, she predicted we would be moving more into a visual culture, and then with streaming and our phones and the way that we consume entertainment, that's where we are. It's very visual. And I think that the damage that does, first of all, I will say I love watching television, and I love, my audio drama, which I'll get to later, but I think is a perfect medium between television and books, because you get into the consciousness of a character in the same way. But anyway, the difference, I think, is that, as you said earlier, in books, it's consciousness, right? What a book can do that film can't do is give you the gritty interior consciousness of the characters, and can change point of view in a way that's really deft and insightful. Whereas film and television, we're relying on the exterior expression of consciousness in the acting, in the shots from a director, in the way that it's composed and put together. I mean, all of that's its own language, and all of it is very meaningful. I'm not saying that you can't derive meaning from that, but what's different is that you don't feel like you're lying on top of a consciousness, like it's there with you, which gives empathy, which creates people being able to imagine other lives than their own. And, I worry about that inability maybe to fully inhabit someone else's pain or someone else's joys or whatever, that we're losing when fewer people read.
Right. I mean, so I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I will make a toast with my gin and tonic. That I exactly with what you said. I might add that it is, that it's sort of, to me, fiction is an antidote to loneliness, and that's something that we crave. And so therefore, when people say, oh, the novel is dead, it's going to be supplanted by,
I hate that. Are people saying that?
Reality. Well, it's a straw man, but, people say that occasionally. Let's say that.
Yeah.
I say, forget it. It's not happening. It's something that there's always going to be a certain number of people who crave reading fiction because of what it can do.
I actually think so. I think maybe the way we read is going to change, and the distribution methods of the way we read will change.
Yeah.
and maybe even the publishing houses that control how we read may change. I don't think the novel's going anywhere. So all of my friends out there who are watching, I really think that the novel isn't, it's not like a form that is antiquated. I still think there's new discoveries being made in fiction.
Sure.
But it's me. I'm a novelist, so.
Okay, we're definitely on the same page. Okay, well, I think maybe we should take some of the questions from the audience, because I feel like I want to make sure that we get these answered before we end here. Katie Hughes Pucci asks, will there be a sequel to The Ancestor? The ending seems to lend itself to the possibility.
I hadn't thought of it. If you want to think of Crypto Z as a kind of sequel, you could think of Crypto Z as an extension of that world. Actually, if people like The Ancestor, they'll love the podcast, because there's characters that cross over.
Yeah.
It's not a totally different universe, but that's interesting, because I guess I could do that. I don't know. Maybe there will be. I haven't thought of it.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay. That possibility open. Okay, we also have another question from Aggie Stewart, who says, can you talk about how you plot a novel versus a memoir? What lessons have you learned about plotting in each genre? Because you've written some very successful memoirs in addition to some very successful novels. So what are the differences?
Honestly, well, the difference obviously is that, whatever happens in the memoir has to have happened in my life. But that said, what happens in my life, what I choose to narrate from my life, is my choice. And so I can collect the experiences that create a narrative in a moving way just as easily as I can write a narrative for fiction, if you know what I'm saying. Like, basically, it's all about how you put it together and creating suspense and questions. And, with the memoirs, it's very similar. I still start off with a kind of theme or a question that I want to answer for myself, and then move through and answer that in the end. With fiction, plotting, if you just if you're asking me very technically, as I said before, I have a sort of large beginning, middle, and end vision for the book. And then I break it down section by section and actually make little outlines as I'm writing for the next section, so that I know where I'm going, and then move things around.
Cool. Okay, so we have a question from Tom Bedell, who says, you mentioned that you have some rituals for each morning of writing. Can you elaborate?
Oh, I kill a chicken, and then
Actually, no. Now, if you read the book, this might not be so surprising to you.
Yeah. No. So I do. My desk is a certain way. I don't check email in the morning. I don't interact on social media in the morning either. Like, I sometimes will post just like a good morning little thing somewhere, but don't look at responses. And I sort of set out things in a certain way. I have some candles in my office that I sometimes light, actually. And I have, I really believe in setting small goals. So those goal setting rituals are very important. So for example, if, today I'm finishing up a section in the book that's one character. And so I set a goal to finish up to a certain point, and I write it down. Like, I visualize it and I write it down, so that at the end of the day I can go back and look and see, did this happen, and how far away am I from meeting those goals. So I think that because a novel is such a big, messy process, that you have to make these sort of small, manageable micro goals, and then reward yourself when you do it. Otherwise, you're just going to feel overwhelmed.
It's such a big job. I mean, writing a novel or a memoir is such a big thing that incrementalism, to me, is the only way to do it. A little bit every day. Yep. Or as often as you can. Okay, we have a question from Amy Pearsall, who says, did you discuss whether you traveled to, did you travel to the Italian Alps as part of your research?
I did actually. Yes, I did. I went, so the part of the Alps where the book is set mostly is in the Aosta Valley, which is just south of Mont Blanc on the Italian side. And I went there for a week and, stayed in a hotel like right below Mont Blanc and hiked through the mountains, tried to sort of figure out where exactly that village was going to be. I had already written a draft of the book, but when I went, right, which is also partially why my revision process takes forever, because I tend to do that. I'll get the whole thing out and then go and get the details. And, ate a lot of the food there, drank the wine. I stayed overnight in a castle to sort of help me feel like what Monte would be experiencing when she went to the castle. So, yeah, I did. It was great.
It's great, actually. I love the way that there are little hints that are dropping about what the setting of the book and various things that happened in the book. And everybody who hasn't read it is just going to have to go out and get it. Let's see. Okay. Well, this is a question from Tom Bedell, who says, did you create the Monte Bianco family tree, and are there any real individuals lurking within?
Oh, interesting. So I'll show you. I have the Monte Bianco family tree. I did create it completely. I'm going to hopefully, I don't know if this will work.
Oh, yes.
So that's the family tree. And it was an ordeal because actually making a family tree that goes back to the 12th century is quite involved, right? And I actually mapped out that what you saw was not that entire span, but that was like the first 4 or 5 generations, and then it went back to the 12th century. And so creating, such an abundance of people, right, and trying to keep them distinct was really interesting for me. I've never made a book or created a family that has, so many branches and so many different people. But I did use, the House of Savoy, I don't know if you've heard of the House of Savoy. They were an old Italian family in the northern part of Italy. I read a lot about them. And when I went to Italy, when I went to these castles, I was seeing what these families did, how they were composed, who married who, what their family crests were like. So that was really an ordeal. And also just narratively for those writers out there, like, how do you keep characters distinct? Right? You can't just throw a bunch of names into a book and expect anyone to remember them. And actually, I have to say, like, I, even as the writer, didn't remember all of those people, which is why I made the family tree.
Right.
So
I have to say that that's a really wonderful aspect of the Ancestor, is the family. It feels like it really feels like there's a kind of long and deep history, which is a reflection of the research that you were just talking about. But it's wonderful because the characters in the family tree are also interesting. And I think that this is another thing that sort of calls to people who these days, everybody's doing, not everybody, but many people are fascinated by genealogical research. And so I think there's a lot of, kind of resonance with people because you're discovering that everybody, if you do enough research into your family tree, you will discover some things that,
amazing things,
maybe wonderful things, maybe not so wonderful things, So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that aspect of it. And someday I would love to do a kind of writing workshop about family trees, genealogies. I think that would be,
Okay, so we have another question. Maybe we just have a few more. Amy asked, do you think you will write another memoir?
I always say that I hope not. Because I only write a memoir when something really extraordinarily interesting happens to me, or a story that I just can't think of putting in fiction, right? Like, I don't know. I have this this gets to the heart of why I write fiction and memoirs. With memoirs, anything that's happened to me personally, I would rather put in a memoir than in my novels.
Yeah.
So I always say, I hope not.
Yeah.
I'll stick with that.
Too. I hope not too, for that reason. Okay, so Leah asked, this is a very writerly question. Tips, please, for your time, organization, and strategy while working on more than one project, revising one while drafting another, for example.
So I don't really do that. I'm a Scorpio. I'm a Scorpio. No, I'm very like, I'm focused, you know, when I'm on something, I'm on it. If it's away with my editor, for example, I finish a draft of a novel and I send it away, then I can work on something else because it's not on my mind. I'm not actually like in the afternoon revising something and in the morning writing something. I've always seen it as sort of a problem for me because it makes me less productive than I would like to be. But I think it also contributes to the intensity of the writing and the intensity of the work, is that it's a bubble that I'm in and I don't exit it usually until that project is over.
I have a question. Actually, this is sort of a side question. So do you have any advice that you would give to someone who wants to write a novel, like someone who's never written one and wants to write one?
So the standard advice you always hear from people is read. Read. And that's true. But I would also say, get a whole bunch of notebooks and just write, you know, every day, write 5 pages in that notebook about anything. You know, about yourself, about your friends. It doesn't have to be a story. It doesn't have to be fiction, just anything, so that you get into the ritual, the sort of meditative quality of writing and the habit. Because if you get into that habit, you'll find that suddenly everything shifts around it. You're not going to feel like yourself that day if you haven't written those 5 pages. So reading, of course, is important, and absorbing story. But I think Flannery O'Connor said that, you know, writers know everything that they need to know by age 5 or something. So you know it, right? You know your stories, you know the emotional reactions that characters will have. The hard part now is just doing it, just getting it on a page, getting those things that you know on a page. So more than anything, just actually sit down for an hour or 2 every day and write in your notebook, or write in the, you know, if you do it on a computer, that's fine too, but just do it.
Yeah, little by little, not looking at it as a big project, but just taking a little chunk every day.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it will grow. You'll find that, I think what's interesting to me is, I remember when I tried to first start writing, and it was so hard. Like, I remember sitting, you know, just like knocking my head against the wall. But it does become something that's as a part of you as eating lunch or taking a shower or taking a nap or going, you know, like it just becomes part of your day. And that's where you want it. You don't want it to be this extraordinary fetishized moment where you're like, I have to write, I have to write, I have to write. And I know a lot of students of mine do that, and then they get there and there's so much pressure on that time that it becomes sort of broken off from you and your life. But it has to, if you can integrate it into your life as being just really part of your life, then I think that makes a big difference.
Very true. So one final question. This is from Tom Bedell. He says, since this is a literary cocktail hour, is that, I'm going to pronounce this wrong because my French isn't very good, is that Genepi des Alpes you're drinking?
It isn't, but that's what's in the book. Yes. Genepi is what really messed Bert up in the middle of the book. No, this is an Aperol Spritz, because if I were drinking Genepi, I wouldn't be able to answer your questions. I wouldn't be able to, you know, be me.
Well, on that note, I just want to thank you. It was so great talking to you, Danielle, and I really urge everyone to go out and get this book. It's really great, and this is a Brattleboro Literary Festival Literary Cocktail Hour. So thanks a lot.